Hello, everyone. How's it going? Hope everyone's having a good ACDC so far. Bill Kelpakaglu, aka Molotov Cockatiel, if you know me on social media. I'm here with Anna Kelly from Georgetown University. She's gonna present us with her game Guam 2030, or really gaming the missile defense of Guam, lessons from Guam 2030. We're going to look at, I guess, hypothetical near future conflict between the United States and China if China was to make a play for Guam. I'm going to be in the background. I hope everyone has a great stream. I'm going to let Anna take over and tell us about her game. And go ahead and a little about yourself.
Of course. Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you for watching the stream today. My name's Anna. I'm a junior at Georgetown University, where I'm majoring in government and computer science, minoring in science, tech, international affairs, all of which is to say I'm very interested in the convergence between advanced technologies and policy, government, military affairs. So there's a class at Georgetown University where you can essentially create a war game throughout the course of the semester. We played war games, we learned how to make them. And then our final project culminated in making our own war game. So that's what I'll be talking about today. I ended up developing a game called Guam 2030, which, as you can see in the description, it's a two-player offense-defense game where the US is on the defense, purely using missile defense, some other domains, and China's on the offense. So using missiles, space, cyber, and different advanced weaponry to try and neutralize Guam in a potential 2030 scenario where China would be making a play for it. So I'm excited to talk to you all about it today. And yeah, we can get started with the slides whenever you're ready, Bill. Okay, thank you. All right, that is the title slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so today I'll just be talking a little bit about the background of the game in general. So the general context around Guam, why it's important to be talking about, why missile defense is important to talk about, where American missile defense in the Indo-Pacific stands, where it should be. And second, I'll be looking at my design process and trade-offs. So for anyone who is familiar with missile defense, it's an extremely complex topic, and there is no possible way to scope all of it into a singular game. So there was a lot of trade-offs that came along with that, so I'll discuss what made me choose to include certain missiles versus exclude certain missiles, why we are choosing theater missile defense versus thinking about broader systems at large. Third, I'll be talking through how the game actually works. So we'll do a quick walkthrough. I'll talk through key mechanics and how the different moving parts that make the game actually function, how they work and how they were designed. And finally, I'll talk through some lessons learned. So I was able to do quite a few play tests with people from my class, people from the Department of Defense, Raytheon, NATO, and getting their feedback on this game was very helpful in understanding where my game process is at right now and where it can go. So throughout the presentation, if you have any questions or comments, I'm happy to see them. Questions I'm happy to answer as they come up as well. So feel free to use the chat feature on YouTube. I think it'll show up to me directly here, so all good there. And then next slide, please. Okay, so first just starting off with why is Guam important? For one, it's considered the tip of the spear of US Indo-Pacific defense. So when we're thinking about exactly where the US territory extends abroad, we have Hawaii, which is pretty far out there in the Pacific. Guam is even further, and it is within striking distance of China. It's within striking distance of Guam, and it's due to that proximity that it is an extremely critical node for US logistics in the Indo-Pacific. And for the past we've had Guam as a territory for the past 130 years, since the late 1890s, which we took during the Spanish-American War, and we've had it since then. It was a huge hub for us during World War II. During the Cold War, the max capacity of troops there was about 26,000. Now it was on a general decline post-Cold War, reaching levels of about 5 to 6,000 troops. But today, we're seeing a slow ramp up again as tensions rise in the Indo-Pacific. The Department of Defense owns about 25% of the territory on Guam, which you can see at that map to the left. All those like black and gray areas that aren't, that don't look like terrain, those belong to the military, and they're home to two key bases. There's the naval base in Apple Harbor, and then there's also Anderson Air Force Base, which is to the northeast of the island. And so today, between those two bases, there's also a Marine Corps base there. There's about 10,000 troops that are currently stationed on Guam, and that's something we've seen steadily rise in recent years. Second, there's a Marine battalion being relocated from Okinawa, Japan to Guam for various political international reasons, but we're seeing that growth there as well. And finally, in a potential Taiwan scenario, this would be the place where the United States is going to be stationing its planes, its bombers. It's where it's going to be stationing and redeploying its submarines from. It's where essentially our critical node of operations has to be stationed from. So next slide, please. Thank you. So Guam, as the US's largest air and naval base in the Indo-Pacific, situated directly against China's growing missile arsenal, military modernization, what we consider China as a quote-unquote pacing threat. Though, me personally, I don't know how much I would still consider it pacing. So there's a key trade-off there in understanding how we can continue to protect Guam while understanding that China is an adversary in this arena, and Guam is a critical node that we would have to protect. So this comes down to one key question I was trying to answer throughout my analysis of the situation within Guam, situations in the Indo-Pacific, and then, of course, the many weaknesses within US missile defense in general, but that are key to missile defense in general, as it's not a perfect science or art. Specifically, I wanted to look at with this game, what trade-offs does an offensive China and a defensive US manage in a hypothetical conflict over Guam, purely in the missile defense theater? And so in a little bit, I'll be talking about the scoping of that and exactly what that key question means. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so here I can dive into the scope of the game a little bit, because as I spoke about earlier, it's really hard to do a missile defense game and cover every single domain that it could be incorporated. So first of all, I chose to situate this game within 2030. So that's it's 4 years from today. It's also 3 years past when the Chinese military is supposed to be ready for an invasion of Taiwan. There are some open source estimates that say that the Chinese military is priming for a 2027, or for having their military ready to invade Taiwan if they wanted to in 2027. And so that was a key date I had in the back of my mind. So I didn't want to be too close to the present. I don't think China would invade Taiwan in 2027, maybe a few years past that. So I went with 2030 as kind of a mid ballpark estimate of if this hypothetical conflict were to occur, we're going with 2030. It also allowed time for different advanced technologies and weapons that I will be talking about in this presentation. It gives them an extra few years to mature past what we would see today, this year, and also next year as well. Second, I was looking at 2 players, so the who of the game, and that would be China and the US. What this means is that I specifically excluded US NATO allies. I excluded US allies in the Indo-Pacific, like Japan, South Korea, Australia, which could have very easily been included, but I chose not to include these specific allies and partnerships, mostly because they would not have the same impact as a China versus US game would be. I also chose to exclude China's strategic partnerships. So China only has one real ally, and that is North Korea. That's their only treaty ally. But they do have strategic partnerships with a lot of other countries, including Russia, Iran, Venezuela, many other countries. These aren't formal or treatized, but I chose not to include these because they weren't as official, and I think China's military outweighs that by a lot. But what I did consider when looking at the who was thinking about service rivalries within the United States. So I was thinking about splitting China into two separate players. So maybe like one side of it would be like the People's Liberation Army, and the other side would be the People's Liberation, like I think rocketry side of it. So just splitting it into the two services that would be necessary for missile offense. And then for the United States, dividing it into either the Army and the Navy, which we'll talk about later, covers most of the missile defense within the United States, splitting it between Indo-PACOM, the Indo-Pacific Combatant Command, and then maybe, some Guam Joint Forces operations. But I eventually just chose to scope it down into China and the US. Third, where Guam, that is the subject of this presentation, I excluded other Indo-Pacific island territories because there are some that could be included, but it takes away from the core of the game. Fourth, I scoped down domain, just two missiles and missile defense on a tactical level. So what that doesn't include, and I'll talk about this later, it doesn't include intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. It doesn't include nuclear weapons. And there are limited domains that are accessible via investment cards. So I'll talk about that a little bit later too. So you can access cyber, space, research and development abilities. You can access logistics, but that's not really the central part of the game that you directly interact with. And finally, why we're doing this in general, just to give a quick 3-sentence summary. The location of Guam makes it the forwardmost point of US Indo-Pacific defense. Second, China has specifically, China has the intent, the potential intent to carry out a contingency like this through actionable developments. For example, their DF-26 missile is named the Guam Express because its range is exactly enough to reach from, I think, Hainan Island in the south of China to Guam, like very exactly. And finally, the severity of the situation in general. Neutralization of Guam would be a huge, huge blow to the United States, and it would make it extremely hard for the US to exert theater influence in a potential contingency because we would not have our own territory to operate from. We would have to operate from Japan or South Korea or maybe another one of our islands in the Indo-Pacific that isn't as well developed. Next slide, please. Okay, and so then here, just to make sure we're all on the same page with what I'm talking about for the rest of the presentation when I talk about missile defense. So there are 3 types of missiles we'll be talking about today, mostly. One is a ballistic missile, which follows a very set trajectory. It's called ballistic. It's like a bullet, right? So it goes up through the atmosphere, it comes down, and it has different phases from before it enters the atmosphere, while it's in the atmosphere, and then while it's on its terminal phase, it's being delivered down to its target. Second is a cruise missile, which kind of hugs the terrain. It goes very fast. It's very hard to detect on radar because it doesn't have as traditional of a trajectory as a ballistic missile. It also uses an engine like a jet, so it's more like a plane and flying. And then that's how it'll get to its target there. And finally, there are boost glide vehicles, which just have a very unpredictable trajectory. And we'll be talking about those later, but specifically in the hypersonic context, so going faster than a speed of Mach 5. And most of the cruise missiles go at a speed of, I believe, Mach 3. Ballistic missiles are a bit slower than that in general. Next slide, please. And then for the defense of these different types of missiles, there are going to be radars on the ground that need to be detecting the missiles in their different phases. It's easiest to defend against a missile when it's in its initial phase, as you can see. So that would be that first quarter. So for a ballistic missile, that's before it enters the atmosphere. It's the easiest to track at that point, and therefore it's the easiest to shoot down. But it is the hardest for missile defense to actually target in that way. And then first, actually sensing where exactly these missiles are. That's an extremely difficult science. There are sensors that from satellites that are trying to track where they are at any given moment. There are radars on the ground. There are radars in the sea. There are radars within the different interceptor batteries as well that are trying to track where the missile is. And essentially, all these different sources of information have to be working in complete harmony so they're able to find where the missile is, and then the interceptor needs to exactly go straight to where the missile is, intercept it, and then you usually need more than one, to be honest, but we'll talk more about that later too. But just so we're on the same general level of what offensive missile systems are, the ones we'll be talking about, and how exactly defending against them works, and how many different discrete systems need to be working together in perfect tandem for an interception to be carried out. Next slide, please.
Anna, can I ask a question here? I
Yeah.
was just curious, do any of these missiles change direction after, or I'm wondering, is it possible to discern roughly where their target is going to be during their flight, or do they, do they go in a straight line, I guess, or do they at some point change directions to maybe hide where what they're targeting?
That's
Yeah.
a great question. Ballistic missiles follow a very specific trajectory where you can tell where they're going because they follow a pretty perfect like parabola from where they're launched into the atmosphere to where they land. And it is like almost like a bullet in that sense. So you can track that trajectory very easily. They also have a rocket engine, so it's just like you launch something up, and what happens after that, it's just due to the coordinates you put in beforehand. Something like a cruise missile, it's it's a lot harder to track, and I think you have more operability within moving cruise missiles, but within a lot of these there's like a circular error probable, so you can't exactly tell where within a certain radius it's going to hit and if it's going to hit in general. And there are some advanced missiles where you can control exactly where they go after the boost phase, but we won't be getting into those in a ton of detail. And then different
Gotcha.
types of boost glide vehicles and hypersonic glide vehicles, those are the ones that are extremely maneuverable, and they can move in a lot of different directions at once, and those are a lot harder to track.
Wow. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay. So then having set that baseline, just looking at different missile defense considerations, all from open source, all from just general synthesis of what the main considerations are when we're talking about missile defense. For one, it's imperfect. So as I talked about earlier, there's so many radars and sensors and people and different operations, different services that have to be working perfectly together to have a perfect image of where a missile is at a certain point, and then to make sure that the interceptor is able to be released from the battery perfectly and then hit its target perfectly. What this means is that there's no 100% success rate. It's pretty, I wouldn't say pretty rare, but it's probably like 50% success of like any individual interceptor being shot at a missile would be my like ballpark estimate. Again, with no like real knowledge, not having been on a battlefield before, but from what I've read online. And this means that there's no 100% success rate, meaning you have to send multiple different interceptors to intercept just one missile. And what this brings me into is point number 3 here, so I'll skip ahead for a second. And that's the fact that interceptors are far more expensive than offensive missiles because they have to be extremely precise. Because missiles, they can have a circular error probable. And when I say circular error probable, what that means is when you say a missile is going to land at a certain target, there's always going to be this kind of circle around it of different places within that circle it could land. It's not going to be super, super accurate down to the meter in every case. It's usually like about, I don't know, maybe 10 meters, maybe more, depending on the type of missile. So interceptors end up being far more expensive than offensive missiles just because of all the different sensors and radars needed to make them work, and then also the precision within the interceptor itself to make sure that it directly intercepts the incoming missile. And that leads to a large cost differential within missile defense in general. But going up to point number 2 again, different interceptors defend against different threats and have different characteristics. I'll go into this in a bit more depth on the next slide, but just to set that baseline, there are different interceptors for different ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, glide vehicles. Fourth, higher probabilities of success require multiple interceptors per threat. So depending on what you think a missile is targeting, you might send more or less interceptors to prevent it from hitting that target. If you see a missile is going to hit like a large city or something, at that point you would want to send probably 3 or 4 interceptors because you want to have an almost guarantee that one of those interceptors is going to hit and it's going to work. If you see a missile is going into maybe like an empty field, maybe you send 1 interceptor towards it, but you're not going to completely prioritize that over something hitting a large city. Fifth, large salvos. So when I say salvo, what that means is kind of a group of missiles you're all sending at once. So large salvos can overwhelm defenses even if your interceptors are effective. There's only so many interceptors that fit in different batteries, and batteries are it's kind of like what missiles are launched from, right? So then there's only so many that can fit in that. 6, interceptors rely on early warning sensors and radars. And 7, not all assets can be defended simultaneously. Next slide. So the three interceptors I chose to incorporate within this game were Patriot missile, or Patriot interceptors, Aegis interceptors, and THAAD interceptors. So as you can see, different services take on these different interceptors. And I have some information about these. I guess it is relevant to the game, actually. So Patriot interceptors are pretty ubiquitous. They're cheaper than other options. They intercept later in the terminal phase, but I chose to scope out the different phases of missile defense, and they're extremely mobile. Aegis, they're deploying an Aegis ashore on Guam, so I chose to include Aegis interceptors, even though they're typically on ships. They're much more expensive. They're much more quote unquote exquisite. They do a great job. And then third is THAAD interceptors, and this is the part of missile defense that the Army has control of. So you can kind of see how there could be some operational constraints between different services operating different types of missile defense, and they all need to work together perfectly. So the THAAD usually serves as a pretty strong second layer if earlier intercepts fail. And again, we're scoping out the ground-based mid-course defense system, which covers the continental US and does not cover territories like Guam. Next slide, please. And then for offensive missiles, I'm assuming all missiles are going to be in range or transported to a place where they're in range. We're scoping out ICBMs, and all missiles are assumed to operate perfectly, which, is a bit of an assumption, but we assume that if something were to happen, it would be the US interfering. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, I chose to incorporate 4 different types of missiles within Guam 2030. And then, of course, we're very close to the part where I talk about the game, I promise. But I chose to incorporate short-range ballistic missiles. So these have a shorter range, less than about 1,000 kilometers. They have, again, predictable arc, easy to spot on radar, and this equates to China's DF-16 missile. MRBMs are medium range. That's 1,000 to about 5,000 kilometers. This includes the DF-26, which is what they call like the Guam or the Guam Express. They also call it the carrier killer. So it's people think it's meant to target like different US carriers. Third, cruise missiles. So these are the low terrain following ones that kind of hug the earth. They're really hard to spot on radars. This is like China's CJ-10. And then fourth is hypersonic glide vehicles. So what these are is they're just attached to different types of missiles. In this case, China's DFCF is what the hypersonic glide vehicle is, and you can imagine it just kind of being attached to a missile, and that's like the warhead on top of it, right? But obviously armed with conventional, it's a conventional warhead, not a nuclear one, and this would be on a DF-17 ballistic missile, and it has an unpredictable maneuverability. It's hard to spot on radars, and that's why we give it such. Later in the game, I'll talk about how that equates to its damage level and when it's spotted. Next slide, please. So within the game in general, with all this in mind, I wanted players to come away with 3 major educational goals. One being fog of war. Imperfect intelligence can really complicate decision-making because within missile defense, you don't exactly know if the missile is real or if it's a decoy. We'll talk about decoys later. You don't know exactly where it's going to hit, and you don't know how perfect your own intelligence is about where it is at any given moment. Second is the cost asymmetry. Missile defense is inherently extremely expensive and imperfect. So sending multiple interceptors against one missile, one Chinese missile is going to cost about, let's say, like $5 million. And then each interceptor, for example, Patriot interceptors cost between 8 and 10 million. And you have to send probably 2 of those Patriot interceptors to have a good shot at getting that one Chinese missile. And so that's an immediate cost asymmetry of 5 million to 20 million. So that's also something I wanted players to keep in mind throughout the game. And finally, defense is not absolute. So even with robust defenses, some missile attacks are going to succeed. And that's why within this game, there is nothing that gives the US player an 100% chance of interception. So you always have to have that risk in the back of your mind of knowing that your defense is not absolute, because that is the name of the game when it comes to missile defense. Next slide, please. Thank you. So within the game, so just for the game objectives, before I get into how it looks from start to finish, I think I have my game board on the next slide after this. But the US's goal is to prevent China from neutralizing Guam, which is a word I keep saying, but the way I interpret it within a game perspective was preventing China from inflicting more than a certain amount of damage. And I'll show how this looks on a later slide, and it'll make more sense. But what this means is that the US has to effectively manage its interceptor inventory, for one. Second, choose investment priorities. And 3, balance its kill probability with a limited supply of interceptors. Whereas China, on the opposite side, as our offensive player here, seeks to neutralize Guam by, ideally inflicting 100% damage onto Guam, and that would allow China to win immediately at any given moment, which is realistic to a real world scenario. But inflicting a little bit more than half of damage on Guam will allow China to have a partial victory, but it will only get a full victory if it reaches 100%. And so what this means is China needs to balance exactly when and how to use different types of missiles, when to use decoys, and when to use its own investment priority cards. Next slide, please. So here is the actual game board that I was working with here. So you can see on the left, we go from 100 HP down to 0 HP. And so we start at 100 HP, and that's kind of Guam being at 100%. And then when I was talking about the victory points a little bit earlier, I think it'll make a bit more sense on this kind of like declining, like touchdown type map. So you can see that if China reaches just, maybe does 20 damage against the United States is still going to win because it still has most of its operational capacity on Guam sufficient. And this is akin to a real world scenario. A few strikes on Guam aren't going to, like take away the entire ability of the US to operate on the island. But when it starts degrading half of the island and half of our operations there, that's when we're giving China a partial victory, because that's when the US's operations on the island are degraded enough to pose a real operational risk and impact. And then finally, 0 HP is when China has done 100 HP. It has destroyed, every military thing on the island, right? So I was trying to kind of scope out civilian stuff out of this because there are many civilians who live on Guam, but the operational capacity of the United States on Guam only has to do with the military, really. And then looking at the other half of the board, so the right half, I'll be walking through exactly what each of these phases mean, but to give you a quick like start to finish of what the game looks like in its actual capacity. So we've talked about the missiles, we've talked about the interceptors, how exactly are both players supposed to operate with these within a game setting. So the way I chose to do this was by incorporating both a investment capacity of the game. So if you can think about like short and medium term national-wide like research and development investments, and then also into a second tactical half. So that would be actually, what does it look like when you are, in a tank in a battery, when you're just, I guess, a troop on the ground and trying to determine how many interceptors to send, or if you're, on the opposite side, you're a soldier in China, how many missiles to send, which combination, and how to do that. So what this means is we start with an investment period where players have a set of cards to choose from. I'll go into this more depth later, but this is just an earlier overview. So players can choose different investment cards, and these will be their long-term investment priorities. And this will be things like for the US, it's investing in cybersecurity. So it's almost like the zero trust initiative that the US has going on right now. It'll be investing in better interceptors, so making them more accurate against more different types of missiles. And on China's side, it'll be things that make their offense better, so they can invest in things like more precision within their missiles. That means that they can hit their targets more precisely. It means that they're investing in offensive cyber operations, OCO, which means that they can essentially degrade the US interceptors, mid-flight if needed. So players are able to choose their investment priorities there, and they only do that once during the game. So it's like your nation setting your goals in like 2030, and then years later we can imagine that this game takes place over multiple years, so multiple different attacks over multiple years, and then each player is able to draw from these short and medium term investment priorities. So then after that investment period is done, the turn begins, and there are going to be 3 different turns throughout the game. And you never do that investment period again, but what you do is you do deal. So you choose different investment priorities to play, and they all have different abilities. You then buy your interceptors if you're the United States, or if you're China, you buy missiles. Then finally, you go into an attack and defend phase. And what this is it's essentially going into getting your intelligence, choosing how you're going to attack an incoming salvo of missiles, actually doing the interception itself, and updating damage and moving to the next type of missile. So to give you a little bit more insight on what that looks like, you can see the order of detection within the center of this game board here. And there are 4 different phases. The first one is short-range ballistic missiles. Second is MRBMs, medium-range ballistic missiles. third is cruise missiles, and fourth is hypersonic missiles. But essentially, China is launching all their missiles at the same time, and this order of detection is when, like realistically, the United States would see these missiles on its radar if they're all launched at the same time, which is, again, a scoping thing. I chose to have the United States not respond to every missile at the same time. I chose to have it split up so the US responds to different missiles at different times, rather than a combination, just because it's easier on the player when each one has a different, combinations. And yeah, so there was, okay, wait, I see a question. Why 2030? Was there a specific technology expecting to be deployed by then? Was there someone that told you to use 2030? Just grabbed a random date. Yeah, I talked about this a bit earlier, but what I chose 2030 because it is past the 2027 date when the Chinese military would essentially, like open source estimates say that's when they would be ready for a potential Taiwan contingency, so a potential Taiwan invasion. And Guam 2030 is meant to take place in a situation where China is hoping to neutralize Guam because of a potential Taiwan conflict. Because this would be the forwardmost node, it would be where I guess China would choose to strike if general. But yeah,
Looks like you had a follow-up to that.
Perfect. How does the game change the further you push it out? What it means is it would mean that technologies get more advanced. The nature of the game would not necessarily change. If you pushed the game further out, the core parts of missile defense are not going to be different unless, I guess if and when Golden Dome, so that's, the US's major missile defense system that's trying to put space-based interceptors within orbit. And then multiple years, yes, that would change how the game looks. I chose to scope that out because there's not really a great architecture of what it looks like right now, in open source at least. So I chose to scope that out, but in a potential future scenario where there were space-based interceptors, this game would look different because the US would be able to strike much earlier, and it would be able to strike from a fourth place, where I only have 3 interceptors types included in this game. Golden Dome would include kind of a fourth layer, and that would be from the space-based layer.
And I had a question about the invest phase. Is each player just dealing 9 cards, or are they looking from? Are they able to look at the cards and just pick from a pool of cards?
They're able to look from a pool of cards. So they're choosing from 15 cards. They have full visibility over it, but I have some slides on that later. I'm just going through
Sorry.
No, it's all good. Yeah, I know I'm going through all of this very fast right now, but I wanted to give you a look of why we're starting at point A to get us at point B.
Gotcha.
But yeah, with that in mind, we can go to the next slide. So game mechanics. This will hopefully answer some questions that are in the back of your mind. Next slide, please. So we've already talked about this a little bit, but the structure is you do the investment period, then you have 3 discrete turns, and all 3 of those turns look the exact same. The deal period, a buy period, an attack period, and that attack phase, or in that attack period divided into 4 individual subphases. Next slide, please. So then game begins. Next slide. And we're starting it with the invest period here. We can go to the next slide. Sorry, I thought I'd have slide control abilities. There's going to be a lot of those. Okay, so talking a little bit more about the invest phase and what that means. So we're just starting the game, right? Each player is choosing 9 cards from a pool of 15 cards. So each one of them has a different set of 15 cards. The US is choosing from 5 major categories. And these, again, would be the categories that would support US defensive efforts. So one would be radar and sensing modernization. So that's, better intelligence about when and where missiles are coming from. Second would be advanced interceptor development. So this would be interceptors that can maybe engage multiple missiles at the same time, which is something that the United States is currently developing, but it does not have that deployed within these theater range interceptors at this time. Third would be cybersecurity. So as we talked about earlier. Fourth would be a joint all-domain operation network. So what that mouthful of a term means is when we're talking about all these radars and sensors that are coming from different parts of the US military complex, when we're talking about interceptors from the Army and interceptors from the Navy, when we have Indo-PACOM and the Combatant Command, when we have with Space Force, the NRO, NGA, all these different sources of information, they all have to be combined into one coherent joint all-domain operation network. So it's all these sources of data being synthesized into one place for defensive purposes. So this would be upgrades to that joint all-domain operation network, which is incredibly important within missile defense. Fifth would be logistics and sustainment boost. So this is understanding that within missile defense of an island, you do still need to sustain your logistics. You need to make sure your ships are coming with supplies. You need to make sure more interceptors are coming. You need to make sure more people are coming, if necessary, to man those different interceptor batteries. That gives you a boost in that way. Second, China chooses from offensive cyber operations, counter space operations, salvo coordination. So what that means is essentially being able to send more missiles together better. Fourth would be electronic warfare. So that's interfering with the US's signals, like every signal that it's in radio wave that it sends. China would be able to interfere with that. And finally, precision strike upgrades, which I talked about a little bit earlier, but just making their missiles more precise. There are 3 cards in each of these individual subcategories, and each player has full visibility within their own set of 15 cards to choose which of the 9 cards it wants to choose. And these 9 cards, they will essentially be played with different capabilities. Next slide, please. So these are what some of the cards look like. So they all have different capabilities on them that do different things throughout the course of the game. So for the US side, for example, for the SRBM phase, China can't use decoys. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but China is able to send decoys that look the exact same as missiles, and the United States has a really hard time understanding what's a decoy and what's an actual missile. Another example is all incoming medium-range ballistic missiles require 1 interceptor and 90% accuracy. So each missile in interceptor has different accuracy rates associated with it, so that just kind of plays with that. But again, I will get into that in a few slides when we get to the attack and defend phase. And on the China side, you can prevent a US interception from being successful during a turn, and you can add a cruise or ballistic missile to your arsenal. And there's 15 cards that are all individual, and then essentially what makes this phase unique is each player can choose which 9 of the cards they want to use later in the game, and then for each turn, and there's 3 of them, they choose 3 cards to play for each of those turns. So what you'll often see is players kind of choose in each of their turns to kind of orient them around a specific type of missile. So for example, like China will try to have a buff against MRBMs during one phase, and so it'll have 3 like buffs to MRBMs or things that would go against the interceptors that target MRBMs. And the United States usually takes a more mixed approach. So the United States would typically try to kind of spread its eggs in multiple baskets, I guess is the best way to put that. Because it wouldn't really make sense, because then the US would get demolished in other missile phases. So they want to kind of spread their efforts across multiple different types. Next slide, please. Thank you. And these are some of the symbols on the cards, which are honestly just a remnant of an earlier version of the game where players couldn't see the capability on the card, but they could see these symbols that tell you what the card does. But I eventually chose to just give players full visibility because it makes it more interesting. That was the feedback I got, and I haven't had a problem with that since then. Next slide, please. And then now that we've completed our investment period, turn 1 then begins. Next slide. And so now we are on the deal period. And so this is when the players actually use the cards that they have gotten from their investment priorities. Next slide. And so within the deal period, they have 9 investment priority cards. Keep in mind what I should say is each player has a large privacy screen, so the other player cannot see the different cards they have, the different missiles, interceptors. It's all completely blocked off. And so behind their own screen, they're looking at these different cards they have chosen. They are choosing 3 of them, and then they're choosing 3 that are going to be public. And these 3 cards with the capability statements are going to be active for the entire turn, not the game, just the turn. And they will play, some cards can be played immediately. Some of them need to be played later in the turn, like during the attack and defend phase. And then, once a card has been activated or set aside, you would then proceed to the buy period. Next slide, please. And now we're moving on to the buy period. This is where China is going to buy its missiles and decoys, and the US is going to buy interceptors. Next slide. So within this buy period, This is when the US and China actually build their arsenals that they're going to use for the rest of the turn. So the US can buy 3 types of interceptors, which is what we discussed a little bit earlier, and these are the THAAD, Aegis, and Patriot. China can buy 4 types of missiles, and they can also buy decoys. So China can buy SRBMs, MRBMs, cruise missiles, and hypersonic missiles, as well as decoys. In decoys, I think I'll have a note about this on a later slide, but they can essentially be used the exact same way as missiles. They just do 0 damage. So they are essentially meant to trick US defenses into having the US waste interceptors. But then while we're in the buy period, so each player has a point range. And this is something that came up because missile defense is inherently a very mathy endeavor. Everything that I'm spelling out in this way is a very abstract version of what is very, very mathematical, very like programmatic, very computer science oriented, right? So what this meant is that players were able to math out exactly how many interceptors and missiles the other side had based off their point total. Because I guess we had some very smart people playing it, and I guess people like to break systems whenever they can. So what I did is I just made it a point range from 26 to 35 points, which means you have a base number of 25, you roll your d10, and that number is added on to that base of 25. And that helped a lot because, you know, it led to some random variation. So to give it a more realistic component to it, you never really know exactly what the United States or China's military classified budgets are. I mean, you know the exact number within the classified budget, but within the United States, for instance, a lot of our 3-letter agencies, you can only see the total number that all these 3-letter agencies get together. You can't see how it's subdivided. You can't see which programs it's invested into. And looking on it from an outside perspective, there's a natural degree of variability based off of how that is divided. And even more so with China, where it's very difficult to trust anything that comes out of their state in general, especially when it has to do with their military. So on a game level, it makes it so players can't math out the game. On a more realistic war game level, what it is it's just natural budget variability within classified programs. Next slide, please. And so then at this point, we're still in the buy phase, right? The US is able to buy different types of interceptors. China is able to buy different types of missiles, and they have different points associated with them. China then arranges their missiles on what's called a launch pad. And what that looks like is it's kind of a paper that they just put different missiles on for different phases, and they put them in order. So China can launch a maximum of 6 objects for each type of missile. So remember, we have 4 phases: SRBM, MRBM, cruise, and hypersonic. They can only launch 6 objects of each type. And I say objects, not missile, because objects can include decoys. And essentially, China places their missiles in a specific row with no gaps in between them. I should have included a picture to visualize this, but what it means is that the order does matter of which China arranges its missiles on this launch pad. So, for example, if we're in the SRBM period and China is choosing to launch, let's say, 4 missiles in 1 decoy, it has to arrange if it's 4 missiles in a row and then 1 decoy, if it's 1 decoy, then 4 missiles. And we're going to need this later because in the attack and defend period, we roll for probabilities for each individual object, so missile or decoy. And yeah, so that's what it would look like for the launch pad. And again, this is hidden. The US player is not able to see exactly what China is buying. They can't see what they're putting in individual ranges. And China can buy missiles and it can keep them in its inventory without immediately launching them on the launch pad. So whatever it's putting on its launch pad means it is being essentially like launched to Guam at that exact moment, right? And so the US is kind of trying to prepare for what might be incoming, and this is based on the capability cards that it has. So objects include farm animals. Can we launch a cow to intercept a missile? Maybe if we put a GPS inside the cow, potentially, and that could get somewhere. But yeah, objects is just going to be missiles and decoys. And let's see.
And are these cards then? Are these cards the objects that China is arranging? Like, what are board game wise? Like, what are?
Yes, component wise, they're laser cut wooden missiles. I don't have any pictures of them because unfortunately my game is still at my professor's house right now, and I was not able to pick it up, so I'm working with my digital materials here. but I was able to use like one of our laser cutters on campus, and they're really cool looking. They're like these little like wooden laser cut missiles, and I have them like painted in different colors and stuff. And the decoys are just kind of unpainted versions of that because you can use them to mimic any type of missile. And then for the United States, their interceptors are also laser cut missile type things, but just different colors of that. I hope that answers your question. It would have been helpful to include a photo of that, but I promise you they're very cool looking and exactly what you'd expect them to look like.
Awesome.
Yeah, but that was a big part of my design process was how can I figure out how to have my missiles actually look like missiles because I don't want to use cards. And yeah, I was happy that worked out. Okay, next slide, please. So here we can see what the exact cost looks like when you're buying these different types of missiles. So decoys cost 1 point, and remember, the player has between 26 and 35 points as its overall budget. The decoy does 0 damage, obviously, because it's fake, and it takes 0 interceptors to kill, but the United States doesn't know if it's a decoy, so sometimes it'll send an interceptor anyways because it doesn't know. SRBMs cost 3 points, and all these cost numbers are generally paired to what I've seen for real world estimates of what either the Chinese or American equivalent would cost. Typically, we kind of went towards the American equivalent just because there was more information on it, and I couldn't really find how much money different types of Chinese missiles cost, except like, you know, these projections that are not grounded in any reality. So I end up using a lot of US data to correlate the two. But yeah, SRBMs and MRBMs are at a point cost of 3, so that's out of 4. I guess 4 is our max points here. They're more expensive just because they're a bit more exquisite, but they don't necessarily do more damage. They just have different capabilities. So you can see that SRBMs and MRBMs both do 5 damage. Cruise missiles cost 2. Cruise missiles are pretty cheap, like in general compared to ballistic missiles. But again, they don't necessarily do more damage. So again, they also have 5 damage. And then hypersonic missiles, they cost 4 points, but they do 10 damage at the same time. Because hypersonic missiles, I was almost playing between making them cost 5 points as well, because hypersonic missiles are incredibly expensive, and people are still trying to figure out if that's for a good reason. If like the benefit of not being able to exactly tell where it is, and because it moves so fast, if that's worth the extreme cost price. And honestly, I could have made hypersonic missiles cost 5 points to make them even more accurate. So you can think of that as like 2 to 3 to 4 times more expensive than other types of missiles for what is not a 2 to 3 or 4 times increase in damage. And then on the far right column here, you can see that it takes different interceptors to kill different types of these missiles. So it would take, this will make more sense later, but a range of 1 to 4 Aegis or 1 to 4 Patriot to kill SRBMs, a range of 1 to 4 THAAD to kill MRBMs, a range of 1 to 4 Aegis or 1 to 4 Patriot to kill cruise missiles, or a range of 1 to 4 Patriot to kill hypersonics. I see a comment. I'm very disappointed to learn from this chart that Tom Clancy lied to us when he said a nerd could reprogram the Aegis to kill ICBMs on the fly. Yep. Yeah, I don't understand the Tom Clancy reference. Perhaps I'm too young, but yes. Aegis missiles, they're exquisite, but they typically do similar things as Patriot missiles, which are very, very ubiquitous. THAAD missiles, or THAAD interceptors, they're able to hit a certain part of like that trajectory we talked about earlier that other types of interceptors cannot do. So that's why we see that sort of division there. Next slide, please. Then we can see what it looks like from the US side as well. I'll talk about how this worked in the playtest at the end of this, and because maybe you're probably having some ideas of why do they all cost 1 point when they do different things. It's fair feedback. I'll let you know my process about that a little bit later. But as you can see, they target these different types of missiles. They all cost 1 point. This was such a hard process for me to choose the cost of how much each of these would be. In my playtest feedback, people told me to make the Patriot missiles more expensive, up to 2 points, because of how often they could be used. Because they can be used against 3 different types of missiles, whereas a THAAD can only be used against 1. But the realist in me could not do that because Patriot missiles are the cheapest. They're the cheapest type of interceptor. They're about 8 to 10 million. They're extremely mobile too. They're ubiquitous for a reason. THAAD missiles cost, I think, 15 million each. That's each interceptor costs 15 million. plus like 25 to 30 million at least in the battery itself and transporting that battery. That is very infrastructure heavy and very semi-mobile, with an emphasis on semi. In Aegis, each of those cost between 20 and 25 million. So what I did is I chose to kind of take the real cost component out of this between the different types of interceptors and just cap it at 1. But in future iterations, there are some ways I'm trying to play with that to keep it realistic while also giving the US player a bit more variation to work with as well. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah, so a note on decoys. I think I've talked about this a bit already, but it's just, they do exist. Different adversary states will use decoys to try and trick US air defenses. So this is the game version of that, forcing the US to hedge, misallocate interceptors, and contend with the fog of war, which aligns with broader educational goals. Next slide, please. And now we are moving on to the attack and defend period. So this is where we do the real tactical interception, whereas in the invest period, we set like short-term and medium-term investment goals. Second, then when the turn begins, we dealt. So it's the United States prioritizing maybe on like a yearly basis, or China prioritizing on a yearly basis, which capabilities it wants to really bring to the finish line. Third would be the buy phase, which is more operational. So it's, trying to predict how many of different types of interceptors or missiles you will need for a potential incoming conflict. And so now what we're going to do is the attack and defend phase. So what that means is actually responding to the different missiles and interceptors that are being thrown your way, how to contend with it, and then incorporating probability in as well. Next slide. Okay, so we're now in the attack and defend phase. So just to give a refresher, we're moving within 4 different phases within the attack and defend phase. And you can see that on the left. So that's our SRBM phase, MRBM, cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles. And again, this is the order of detection based off of if they were all launched at the same time, this is the order in which the US would see them. Not necessarily when they would hit, but when the US would see them and be able to respond to them. And then within each of these phases, we're going to follow the following 5 steps. First one is called approximation, and I'll dive into each of these a bit more. That's, again, giving the intelligence. Second is doctrine. This is a real doctrine that is used on the ground to determine how to respond to different types of threats. Third is the actual interception. And then, fourth and fifth is just updating your damage and moving on to the next phase or the next turn. But next slide, please. We can first start with approximation. And what this is, it's meant to gamify what sensors and radars would be doing in the best way I could think of possible. Kind of inspired, I think, by the social game of the social dice game of above, below, the same, trying to guess what someone's dice is in their cup. So that's kind of where I drew inspiration from for this. But the way it works is the US, so now we're beginning the attack and defend phase, right? So the US will then publicly roll a D6 die. The US, and this is a D6 because China can only launch up to 6 objects, right, per missile phase. So this correlates pretty easily onto it. The US will then ask China if they launched above, below, or the same as that number X that they rolled on the D6. So what this would look like is, let's say the US rolls their D6. Let's say they roll a 3, and this is during the SRBM phase. And then the US would then ask China, did you launch above or below or the same as 3 SRBMs? And China will respond as the number that as above, below, or the same as the number that the US rolled. So, for example, if China had in reality launched 4 SRBMs, this could also include 3 SRBMs and 1 decoy, or 2 SRBMs and 2 decoys, then China would answer, I launched above 3 SRBMs. And this answer is going to include any decoy launched because the US cannot tell the difference. It looks the same to the US. And so this kind of gives imperfect intelligence where, about, I think I did the probability calculation of how many times this is exactly perfect for either player. I forget what it is off the top of my head, but I mean, again, you have a 1 in 6 chance of getting the same, so you know the exact number that the US would know the exact number that the China player is sending of missiles. And then the other times you have imperfect intelligence. Sometimes it's helpful. Sometimes you hear oh, it's less than 6, and that's not helpful at all. Sometimes you hear it's less than 3, and that is helpful. So that's trying to incorporate in the imperfect intelligence aspect of it. And then next slide, please. So the second part of the attack and defend phase is going to be within doctrine. And so if the US has already, it has some amount of intelligence now. If we're moving with our SRBM example, it knows that there are, it knows there are more than 3 SRBMs being launched at it right now. It has that in the back of its mind. It's like, okay, so it's either 4, 5, or 6 SRBMs or decoys being launched at us. And so what the US contends with now is how it wants to respond. And there are 2 different ways the US could respond to this. And there are 2 different, they're called shot doctrines. They're called either shoot, look, shoot, or SLS, and shoot, shoot, look, or SSL. And these are real doctrines that are used within missile defense, specifically on a tactical level. So shoot, look, shoot, what this means is, if we're talking about how we usually need multiple interceptors to intercept one missile, what shoot, look, shoot does is it shoots one interceptor to go up at the intercept the missile. It waits to see if it hits, and then it shoots again. So it shoots another interceptor afterwards, in case the first one doesn't hit. So what it means is it can be more resource efficient, because you can shoot an incoming missile, you can see if it hit, and you might not have to do a second one if you don't have to, right? Because that first one might have already hit, and why would you send a second interceptor at a missile that's already been hit? But what it also does is it has a lower success rate, because what it doesn't have is it doesn't have the compounded success rate of shoot, shoot, look, where shoot, shoot, look ends up being a more aggressive doctrine that can maximize kill probability, because there are higher probabilities associated with shooting 2 missiles at once at the same time versus 2 separate ones that have separate percentages associated. And I'll show you all the statistics for this and percentages that are used in the game, I think, in the next slide in a second. But yeah, there's like slight percentage differences between the 2, with shoot, shoot, look coming out on top by, I think, about like 3 to 5 percentage points in like any given scenario is what I found out. So you would choose SLS, so just still moving on this first row here, when you don't have many interceptors left, so you'd want to be more conservative, where you can afford to take some damage because you have different types of investment cards and capabilities that, maybe add a 10% buff to some of your interceptors, for instance. Or you want to take like a high risk, high reward approach. And so summary of this is it's a lower individual success rate than choosing SSL. There's a possibility of using only one interceptor. There is an automatic failure if you roll a 10 on the first strike. And what this equates to is essentially just my way of manually decreasing the effectiveness of it to fit the broader schema and on a realistic level of shoot, look, shoot being less effective than shoot, shoot, look. And then fourth is it's best for conserving interceptors when you can afford damage. So not to shoot, shoot, look. Again, shooting an incoming missile with 2 interceptors, you get that compound success rate. You look to see if it hit. You obviously can't shoot again afterwards because the missile has already hit you at that point, right? This is a very time-intensive thing. You use SSL when you can spare interceptors, when you can't afford to take damage because of investment cards, and when you want to be more cautious and you have the ability to spend more interceptors for a higher success rate. And typically in real scenarios, this would be 2 missiles. I allowed an option for players to do up to 4 missiles and shoot, shoot, look. So that's like shoot, 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 look for that one. But again, just calling that SSL. And I was curious to see if players would ever choose that option, and they chose it a lot more than I thought they would. So it shows how cautious people try to be, even when they have like very limited inventories to work with, just because I guess the psychological thing of you don't want to be hit by a missile, right? So you want to do everything you can to prevent that. And then SSL is also used for high damage missile types. So you would likely really want to use this against hypersonics, which do 10 damage, versus like a cruise missile, which does 5. So then a player will choose this for each of the individual missile phases, not for a turn. For SRBM, it'll choose a doctrine. For MRBM, it'll choose a doctrine, and so on. Next slide, please. And so then we're moving on to interception. So the US has the intelligence from approximation. It has chosen its doctrine within the doctrine phase. And now within the interception phase, the US is going to choose how many interceptors to send and where to position them on its own kind of interception board. And so the US can choose to either send 2 or 4 interceptors generally within SSL against different missile types. If we're on SRBMs right now, the US has, let's say the US chose like the SSL doctrine for SRBMs to move with our example, where there's more than 3 SRBMs incoming at the United States right now. So the US then has its own interception board that mirrors we can go to the next slide, actually. I think this will be helpful. Or sorry, next slide. Next slide. Yes, this. I can just talk through it while looking at this too. I might have to go back 2 slides in a second. But you can see what this board looks like where at this point, the bottom of it isn't what China's launchpad looks like. China has its own launchpad behind its privacy screen. Then the US still is not able to see exactly what missiles or decoys China has. China will reveal those as the US puts interceptors down. But what the US will do is it will choose it will put the number of interceptors it wants to send in each slot. So if the United States knows that there's going to be more than 3 missiles being shot at it, the US is probably going to put 2, and this is SRBM, so it'd be Patriots or Aegis. So 2 interceptors within slot 1, 2 within slot 2, 2 within slot 3, 2 within slot 4. It could do 5 or 6. Let's say it goes all the way up to 5, so it'd be using 10 total interceptors. And where it is specifically within, like the 4 blue, I guess, interceptor slots within each individual interceptor salvo, that order doesn't matter. But what does matter is the interceptors it has from, if it puts interceptors in slot 1 versus like slot 4, for instance. So I hope that kind of makes sense. So if we know China is sending more than 3 missiles, the US can put interceptors anywhere within 1 to 6, depending on, or anywhere within 1 to 6, likely within 4 to 6, or likely including 4 to 6. So it can then choose the order of exactly where it thinks the decoys and the decoys and actual missiles are going to be within the way China has set up their own missiles. And then can we go back 2 slides, please? Thank you. And so now that we're in the attack and defend phase, so we've seen, I guess, what the general not the launch pad, we've seen like what the interceptor board looks like, right? So the United States has put up its interceptors, let's say all the way up to slot 5 there. So there's 2 interceptors in each one. Then the United States chooses if it wants to use Patriot or Aegis missiles for them. And then there's these probabilities. It looks like a lot, but it ends up being like pretty easy to do in the actual game. For shoot, shoot, look, if it did 2 interceptors for each one, it's going to have an 80% success rate. So we would just roll a d10, and it's going to be successful if that d10 rolls less than or equal to 8, and it's going to fail if it rolls at a 9 or a 10. And in that case, if it rolls a 9 or a 10, that's when that damage would be subtracted from the initial, from the broader Guam damage tracker. And then we can stay on the slide for a second and just take a look at the different probabilities here. So you can see that the first interceptor within shoot, look, shoot has a pretty low probability, right? And you can see how you're doing 2 separate probabilities for shoot, look, shoot, whereas for shoot, shoot, look, it's a composite. It's a composite probability. So within all of them, shoot, look, shoot, and shoot, shoot, look have different effectiveness depending on the missile that they're being directed against. But this is that's kind of more in the back end of me choosing the percentages, was me considering which type of missiles they were against and which types of interceptors were sending them. And so that's why there are slight variations within them, is to kind of reflect which missiles are harder to shoot down and then which interceptors are more effective than others. Like the lowest interceptor I think we have is like the first Patriot against a hypersonic has a 30% success rate, right? Second Patriot would be 50% success rate. But then again, when you combine those 2 percentages together, it gives you, I think slightly less than 60% within that. So it's not a huge difference, but it's enough of a difference to maybe consider. Although I don't think I saw players really consider the composite probabilities, which is entirely okay because I don't want this to be a game that people have to math out, even though oftentimes I think I saw people did choose to math it out. Next slide, please. Let's see. Yes. And so now the United States has, chosen its interceptors. You've seen the probabilities. What the US would do is for each interceptor from, I guess, let's say like 1 to 5, right? The US is going to roll for it with its D10, figure out if it's successful or if it fails. And then depending on what that outcome is, if it's a kill or not, China will reveal if it had a missile or a decoy. And there ends up being like quite a bit of tension in this phase. And it's kind of fun because the US like finds out if like, its tactics worked, if it chose the right doctrine, if it like guessed where the decoys would be effectively. And then China at this point is just kind of like waiting and seeing to see if the interceptors are going to hit. And then you continue along, rolling for each different interceptor salvo until the US has sent no more interceptors. And then if there are any more missiles that China has sent, China will then reveal them on the board. Next slide, please. Yeah, so board, you can see in the center we have like the kill thing too. So I have little tokens you can put there to mark if it's a kill or not. Next slide. And then finally, you would update the damage. So you'd update the HP tracker for any missiles that hit. You'd clear the Guam board steps I to V and steps 1 to 5 in the interceptor board. Then in this case, you'd move on to the next missile phase, which would be MRBMs, or you'd move on to the next turn if you had just finished your hypersonic phase. Next slide, please. Yep, turn concludes. We'd repeat, or the turn doesn't conclude because you would do I guess you would do that part of the turn, or the attack part, like three more times, right, for the different phases. But then once that is concluded, the turn concludes and you do 3 more turns of that. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, just bringing us back to the board here, which will hopefully make more sense now that we understand how the different aspects of it work. When you're updating the damage, you will be updating it to the left and just moving downwards. And also on the left, I added little descriptions to show like what generally might be happening at these different levels. And now that we understand the different damage levels, for the US for the HP of Guam to drop from like 100 to 80, for instance, to 80 HP, that would mean like 4 cruise or ballistic missiles got through, or 2 hypersonic missiles got through, meaning that interception against them was not successful. And then let's see, yeah, we've got a marker for different levels of the turn. There's markers to show where you are in the order of detection. And a lot of feedback I got in my earlier playtests was that it can be a little bit confusing to know exactly where you are. So I try to include as much signposting as humanly possible within this. So you can also track what your approximation is. You can choose whether the player chose above, below, or the same. For doctrine, you can choose the doctrine and then put a little token on it. And you can see within shoot, look, shoot, and shoot, shoot, look, the shoot part of that, those are supposed to be little THAAD batteries. So that's kind of what they look like on, I guess, in an image version, a very cartoon image version. And yeah, next slide, please.
Before we go, can I just ask a question here? Actually, 2 questions. So it sounded like, just confirming, the HP can only go down. There's no effects that let the US player ever regain HP, right?
The US player can regain some HP from different investment cards, actually. So,
interesting.
Yeah, but it's not much. I think there's 1 or 2 cards that allow +5 HP. And typically I've noticed players do choose them, but it's at the cost of losing an offensive card, and 5 HP isn't really going to make or break anything. So it really just comes down to doing the best defense possible.
Gotcha. And my other question, are there any game effects that allow either player to swap cards from the 9 that they've chosen, or are those permanently their cards?
Those would be permanently their cards, yeah.
Okay.
What I did toy with for a little bit was, I mean, there's a whole like tech transfer thing within China where China likes to steal the US's like patents and technologies. So I did consider for a little while if I wanted to allow China to like somehow steal the US's cards and capabilities.
Oh, wow.
And it's still something that's in like the back of my mind because I think that would be like slightly realistic. I think it would have, I think it would be a nice addition to the game. But I ended up
a fun game twist too.
Yeah, I ended up not incorporating it because there's not much China can do if it chooses one of the US's cards and it's like adds 10% to interceptor effectiveness. China wouldn't want that anyways. Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course. So I don't know why the bullets are different sizes on this, but so from playtests, so some of the feedback I've gotten, so this is like some of the lessons learned aspect of what I learned from doing this game in general, was the interceptor cost was a major component that people did have issues with, which is fair. I think I talked about this a little bit earlier, but they thought Patriot missiles should be much more expensive. And sure, maybe they're just not more expensive in general. And that wasn't really like a sacrifice I was willing to make to, I guess, the game's integrity, to how it relates to real missile defense systems. But I think in a future iteration, what was I considering? I was considering different point mechanisms, considering just maybe like lowering the US's overall like point total to kind of manually do that for them, rather than like change the cost of the interceptors, would be change the overall budget you have, which would have a similar effect. But that's not something I have incorporated into this version of the game. I found that the game was very easy to learn. So when people had the game in front of them and I was explaining it probably over the course of like 5 to 10 minutes usually, within one turn, people caught on to it very easily and very quickly, which made me think, and I don't know if that comes across in this presentation at all because it's like the game's not in front of us. Like it's harder to do like a tactical or yeah, tactical, I guess, walkthrough, like with the pieces in your hands when, this is like virtual. But it was so easy to learn for them that I was like, oh, I guess I could add more complexity as needed. So some of the features I was thinking about to add was like on the general game board, if these different, because I have like little descriptions next to each like HP component, if like that would directly relate to, like a buff for the US or like a buff for China, like depending on like which, systems were degraded at that time. But I chose not to actually even think about incorporating that, for instance, because like the first half of the HP would just end up being like buffs to China, essentially. And the whole thing would just end up being buffed to China because it's all in China's favor, like the more the HP goes down. And I think there would be a way to do that in future iteration, but not in this current iteration. And then some other feedback I got was because it was like fairly easy to learn, I think there are different layers of complexity I could add. I was considering adding like a targeting component as well. So that would be like a third part of I guess sort of a fourth major part of the attack and defend phase, which would be targeting in general. So the China player could choose if it was targeting maybe like civilian infrastructure, military infrastructure, or like critical military infrastructure, for instance. And then depending on where it was targeted, the damage impact of the actual Guam board would change. And then the US would probably choose to respond differently because that's just a third point of information it could operate with. And I think that is something I would hope to incorporate at one point, but I was afraid it was a little bit too complicated, but I think I'm at a good point right now where I could add an extra layer of complexity there, and that would just give like the US and China player like an extra thing to work with within the attack and defend phase. Because I think like once you get into it, like I think the whole game probably takes like 45 minutes to an hour to finish with the 3 turns. So I would have like some, leeway to add some other concepts as needed. A third thing that I learned from the playtest was people did want more choice over when and how to use these different investment priority cards. So these are, the cards you choose at the beginning and then you deal them for each individual turn. People wanted choice over how many to use. They were like, oh, it shouldn't be 3 required. It should be you can choose to use 1, you can choose to use 2, maybe have like a maximum of 4. And I thought that made sense. And maybe having like a limit on like, so for example, you can choose 9 cards, but you can only like, I don't know, like play 8 of them or something, right? Like you lose one in your hand at one point. So they choose between that. So those are all things I've been considering of adding in. And then finally, like a common thing that was just kind of in the back of my head throughout the entire process was how to ensure the game isn't rigged in the favor of the US or China. I was initially like very nervous that the game would be rigged in favor of China, so then I put in some kind of manual constraints to at least make the game more playable and more fun for the US player. But then it ended up with the US player winning more than expected, which does not make sense because missile defense it's an attacker's game, right? Like the attacker is always going to inherently have the advantage within missile defense. Because missile defense is so hard, it's so expensive that the attacker is always going to have the advantage. So I think in a future iteration, I would also have to add that component back in to make it not as, specifically rigged in favor of the US because I had to go in and, make interceptors less expensive, right? Because the cost point of an interceptor of 1 does not directly equate to the cost points of different Chinese missiles, even though they have the same overall budget. So that was a problem that I personally noticed. And I think in a future iteration, I would want to make that more budget accurate. So if each interceptor ranges between, I guess, 10 and 20 million, but they cost 1 point, but then what's 2 points for China, which it would be a cruise missile, and that costs about like 5 to 10 million. That cost differential doesn't make sense. I know I'm poking a lot of holes in my own game right now, but these are just kind of things that I've been considering about how to, how to make that a bit better. But for now, like the feedback I got from the game was very positive. People who played it who are familiar with missile defense, they were like, this works. Like this isn't like just, out of like randomly left field. Like this does really relate to different considerations that, people from a national level have to contend with choosing which priorities to invest into. And then on a more tactical level, understanding how exactly to respond to different types of threats and at different points. But I think we can move on to the next slide. And I think, yeah. And
I actually had a question. So,
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did designing this game make you change your view of this, or did you already know ahead of time? Like when you say it's difficult to defend, right? It sounds like a little bit of a no-win situation in real life for the United States. Like how can they keep up, basically? Like without knowing. But just viewing this changed my my opinion of the situation. But I'm wondering, did you go through any of that?
I would say like I just learned a lot more about the complexities of it in general, and just like the biggest thing I learned was how many different moving parts had to be working perfectly just for an interception to work, and that there's a lot of there's a lot of like components and subsystems that just all have to be operating perfectly, and how expensive all of that is. I didn't realize how like critical the cost differential was when it came to defending against different types of missile threats. And I think that was the biggest thing I learned. But when I went into this, I had like a baseline knowledge of missiles and missile defense just from like some of my own personal interests. And yeah, so I ended up, I think like throughout it, I realized how much of an attacker's game it really was. And that, if I have to put in these manual constraints to prevent the attacker from always winning, that's pretty concerning. And then also just looking into different types of arsenals and different types of interceptors too. I thought it was like really interesting how we don't have interceptors that are cheap and can like, kill a missile in one go. And I think going into this, that's kind of what I thought missile defense was. You shoot one interceptor, it kills it. And like, because the United States has great technology. We put so much money into our military. But it's like no matter how much money we put in, we're never reaching 100%. And we will still probably need more than one interceptor, and it's still going to be incredibly expensive. Which like on a broader level relates to how I see a lot of our missile defense investments right now too, which, we see like this whole Golden Dome thing going on, like that whole architecture. I was initially thinking about making a Golden Dome game actually and trying to understand how that fit into like global geopolitics and how it fit into missile defense. But again, the architecture is so up in the air that it's not really something solid you can game right now because there's nothing to game about it. But I think I'm excited for when the architecture for that comes out and when we understand more, because that would really change the way I would have gone about a game like this too if that was included.
Looks like Brett had a question here.
Sure. What's something that significantly changed as a result of play testing and player feedback? A lot of things changed actually. Let me check my notes. Yeah, I initially, like the biggest thing that changed I think was probably the point structure and just how people are trying to math it out so much. People were like literally writing on their papers how many different interceptors and missiles they were guessing that the other player had at any given moment. And so then that's when I had to change the point total for each player during the buy phase. And I thought that was really interesting because I didn't expect that. I didn't think people would start writing down like exactly how many missiles and interceptors the other side had and start planning against that. But then it does just come down to the fact that people, if there's like a system that people can solve, people will try and solve it. So I had to take that solve component out of it. And I had to take that to a lot of different parts of the game too. So initially, I think players couldn't see the different types of investment cards and investment priorities they could choose from at the beginning. Again, they can only see like exactly what category it was in, and then they could see a little bit about the capabilities through a small symbol in the corner. But they couldn't see the exact capability that it was. They just kind of had to choose at random. And that was kind of meant to simulate people in Congress just like choosing between different priorities without like really knowing what they do, It's like, oh, like we'll buy a new radar in the Pacific Ocean. We will like invest in like this cool technology because this defense company told us to, without like really knowing exactly what they're investing their money into and what capability is actually delivered to the warfighter in that sense. But like for gaming and playability reasons, I just ended up changing that to give full visibility to the player essentially in choosing the different investment priorities they were choosing for the game, and just being able to see the capabilities on the back of them.
It's really interesting that they're still using Patriot missiles. Like, are they the same Patriot missiles that have? I mean, I remember those from like what 40 years ago. I know you said you talked to Raytheon and stuff. Like, has any technology changed within that, or are they really the same exact missiles from back then?
They're definitely modernized.
Okay.
Like, yeah, Patriots use I think like PAC-3, I think interceptors now. So like all of these different types of interceptors have like specific like variations of them as well. So these are just kind of like the broadened versions of it, but they've all undergone like lots of different types of modernization. Like within like the Aegis system, for instance, too. Like there are two types of interceptors like within the Aegis system. Like one is called I think one is called like the SM-3 and one is called like the SM-6. And each of those types of interceptors do different things, even though they're deployed on the same like general theater missile defense system, and end up being more expensive, more modernized based on different versions of that. But yeah, there's a lot of money being like funneled into missile defense right now, and Patriot does get a lot of it, and I think that's why it is the cost has been able to go down so much over the course of the years, and why it is so ubiquitous within theater conflict today.
Cool. Well, I don't think we have any other questions. I guess this looks awesome. I'm wondering, like, can we play this, or will we be able to ever play this? Us
Ideally,
non-students.
ideally, I would like to. I'm thinking about like trying to pitch it to some different like I don't know. I'm trying to pitch it to some like congressional offices or something. Which commercial war game companies are you pitching this to? I don't know yet, to be honest. There's quite a bit of work that'll need to be finalized on it for it to get into, I guess, a more commercialized version. I need a lot more feedback in general, understanding how well it maps onto existing priorities. But I'm thinking of bringing it to some different conferences throughout the year in the DC area. I think there's one in like April, maybe, that I might go to and bring it there. But it's very up in the air right now. We'll see how it contends with my school schedule. But I need to get my game from my professor first, so it'll help to have it in front of me. But yeah.
Well, it looks awesome. I mean, really impressive to see. It looks like, pretty surprisingly polished and tight. Like it's surprisingly deep as well. So, I'd be interested. Like, it seems really fun.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, it was product of a long semester of work, but I'm glad I got to a good place.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thanks for everyone for joining the stream. Thank you, Anna. Good luck. I hope you get an A on that. It does look awesome. I guess enjoy your convention, the rest of the convention, everyone. And again, thank you for joining. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.